In this video, we'll come to the last modifier type of the leadership system, debuffs. In some ways, much of what is discussed in this video could be confused for spells proper, so I'll clarify on that as best I can. It should be noted up front that this subject will be trickier to follow than the other modifier types, so take it a little slower. We'll look at several different kinds of buffs, like active debuffs, which include weather debuffs like freezing rain and blizzard, or hero abilities like Dane's Mighty Rage. Other debuffs are passive debuffs and passive nullifier debuffs, which come from heroes like the Nazgul. So without further ado, let's begin. Two debuffs should be noted at this point, since they could be confused with spells. Two spellbook powers, Isengard's Freezing Rain and Angmar's Blizzard, operate like spells. Notice where they say active debuff. They can only nullify leadership and active debuff weather powers. They cannot nullify spells or buffs, like the hero and land powers we've shown earlier in this series. Actual spells cannot nullify other actual spells or buffs. Let's demonstrate. Here's Rallying Call. But notice the gold glow remains with the purple haze of the debuff. The buff effect of Rallying Call remains, but the debuff only affects the default damage armor of the unit. Same with Freezing Rain being placed over Tainted Land. As you can see, Freezing Rain is not a spell, though it can be confused as one. Angmar's Blizzard is the same, so we won't cover that here. Also, Freezing Rain and Blizzard can be nullified by other weather powers, like the Sunlight power for men, or even opposing players' own Freezing Rain or Blizzard powers. This is why in their descriptions that Freezing Rain and Blizzard are qualified as active debuffs and not spells, as spells proper cannot be nullified, but active debuffs can. But only weather-related active debuffs can be nullified, not other active debuffs, like from Dane's spell we explored earlier. Here, Dane has it active. See the fire below his troops and the purple haze over mine. But while Freezing Rain debuffs his unit's default damage and armor and his leadership, his spell itself remains active. We have shown this spell before, but it bears further exploration. Dane's Mighty Rage is a unique ability, in that it is both a spell and an active debuff. And like the active debuffs we've shown, it does cancel enemy leadership while debuffing default damage and armor. While discussing active debuffs, one little addendum should be noted: Mordor's Darkness spell. We explored earlier in the series that no spell can be nullified or cancelled. However, while Mordor's Darkness power is qualified as a spell, it can be nullified by other weather effects, like Freezing Rain, Blizzard, and the Sunlight power. Here, we see Mordor's Darkness spell in use on the blue enemy. Now the gold glow under them is replaced by the purple haze of the active debuff. But this is the only exception to the rule that spells are not able to be nullified. No other spell can be cancelled out. Conversely, it's also the only spell that can cancel out a debuff, albeit only a weather-related active debuff.
The lawful host is ready.
So as you can see, Mordor's Darkness spell is quite unique in the way it plays off of debuffs. In the next section, we'll look at the last kinds of debuffs, passive debuffs and passive nullifier debuffs, like those which come from the Nazgul, and prepare for finally getting to AOTR's overhaul of the whole system. The last part of this series is passive debuffs, including passive nullifier debuffs. There's ultimately not much more to be said, as they work much the same as active debuffs, except with no time limit, of course. Notice where it says passive nullifier debuff. This means that the hero takes away enemy leadership and debuffs default damage and armor. Notice how the gold glow of their leadership from Aragorn completely disappears even with Aragorn present. This is very different from normal passive debuffs that come from lesser heroes or units, like Morgamir. So the passive nullifier debuff is the one that nullifies enemy leaderships. Normal passive debuffs, though, don't. They merely debuff default damage armor of an enemy, whilst a leadership buff would be active. Here, you'll see that Morgamir does not remove the gold glow of Dane's leadership, but only debuffs the default damage and armor. The passive nullifier debuffs obviously do more debuffing than the other. The most crucial difference about both passive nullifier debuffs and normal passive debuffs from the active debuffs explored earlier is that there is nothing to nullify them at all, except killing those units. It should also be noted that while you can use debuffs in conjunction with the leadership buff spell combo to debuff the enemy troops while buffing your own, the debuffs do not stack with debuffs, even in team games. Everything is a technical issue to do with definitions, but important to understand when you need to try to counter the enemy's boosts, or when you need to stack your own. Otherwise, good combos and counters can be wasted. This can be confusing, so here's the breakdown of sections A through B and the upcoming section C for clarification. 1. Weather-related active debuffs cancel only leadership and other weather debuffs. 2. Hero active debuffs cannot be cancelled, but can cancel leadership. 3. Spells cannot be cancelled except for Mordor's Darkness by only weather debuffs. 4. Mordor's Darkness spell is the only spell to cancel weather debuffs. 5. Passive debuffs and passive nullifier debuffs cannot be cancelled except by killing the heroes with them. And 6. Debuffs of any kind do not stack. What's the debuff system like in AOTR? AOTR's debuff system is, generally speaking, about the same, but with one major difference. Debuffs stack without limit, either passive nullifier debuffs, or normal passive debuffs, or even active ones. This can make for some very interesting good versus evil games especially, in particular if a player is playing Mordor. But more on that later in this series. The next section in this series will clearly show the impact debuffs can have in a battle. In this video, we'll take a look at the impact debuffs can make in the heat of battle to determine just how effective they can be, especially in relation to their mechanical opposite, the leadership modifier type. We'll start with looking at the effectiveness of Tier 2 swords against overwhelming Tier 1 swordsmen to set the stage, moving from there to how leadership can turn the tables, and then just how effective debuffs can be to turn them again. Here we have the classic standoff of the Gondor swordsmen against the Dark Dunedain. As before, both sides remain non-upgraded and are level 1, but there are 8 groups of Gondor swordsmen against 4 Dark Dunedain, so 120 troops against 40. Let's see how effective the Tier 2 Angmar troops can be. 40 Dark Dunedain remain standing, a very powerful swordsman unit indeed. Obviously, the Gondor troops need some help with these guys, in spite of outnumbering them so much. Aragorn's leadership should suffice. An unbelievable turnaround. Leadership by itself, apart from the hero with it participating in a battle, can make all the difference in unit performance. But how would its mechanical opposite do, the dreaded debuff, when in opposition to it? We'll look at one of the most powerful of them all to decide. A near-perfect comeback, 40 of 40 Dark Dunedain. What little they lost in the battle was quickly gained back by them leveling up and getting a few troops back. As you saw, the Witch King's debuff, the passive nullifier kind, almost completely sapped Aragorn's effect on his troops. Only the outliers remained unaffected, being too far out of range. And the Witch King's debuff of default damage on top of the canceling of the leadership only added fuel to the fire. Passive nullifier debuffs should not be trifled with. Even a normal passive debuff from a lesser Nazgul would have made a good turnaround, even being unable to cancel leadership. It should be a priority of any player to remove such a source from play as quickly as possible. This concludes coverage on the debuff modifier type. We've now covered all the bases for how all modifier types work in the vanilla game, but we need to see one more demonstration to see the full dynamic play of all of them. After that, we'll finally move on to the Age of the Rings overhaul of the system.